Okay, hello everyone. Today, Abe Singer has graciously agreed to join me to discuss some of the exam questions, hopefully all of them. And we're just going to talk about them, go through them, and raise some of the most important issues, not describing everything you need to do for the questions, but hopefully giving you some indication of how to approach the questions. So let's dive right in.
Do it.
The first question is this: while Aristotle suggests that there are a variety of good regimes, he describes the middling regime of Book 4, Chapter 11 as the best regime. So, in what ways is this the best regime? What makes it good when compared to defective regimes such as oligarchy and democracy? Why is the middling regime better than other good or correct regimes such as the so-called aristocracy or polity discussed in Book 4, and even monarchy or kingship? Okay, so in terms of answering this question, the first thing you want to focus on is Aristotle's main argument in favor of the middling regime. And you'll find this in Book 4, Chapter 11. And several questions come up right away in terms of what Aristotle's aiming at with this regime, or why it might be best. And I think that you can look at this from two different directions. The most important reason, if you're going to just reduce it to the basic reason why this is best, is that this regime is going to be the most stable, and stability seems to be the key. And what's interesting about this is that it's not a regime that's aiming at virtue, particularly political virtue, at least not directly. This is not the regime that's going to create the most virtuous possible rulers, or even the most capable necessarily, but it's going to be best precisely because it's going to be the least subject to conflict, right? So in terms of expanding your answer after looking at this section in Book 4, it'll be helpful to look a little bit at sort of the causes of revolution, the causes of what he calls factional conflict in Book 5, because there you also get a sense of why other types of regimes are going to be more subject to revolutionary change. So the more subtle question, maybe not the most significant for this question, is, why does the philosopher prefer that kind of regime? And I think he's just indicating that this is actually the regime in which philosophical virtue will be, most likely to thrive. Right.
So could you think of it in terms of best and then second best, or ideal and non-ideal? Would that be a way to think about the discussion of regimes?
Well, possibly, but it depends on what perspective you're looking at it. Because if you're looking at, because there's different forms of virtue, and a big theme of the politics is this question of, what is the best life? Can this be understood in terms of the life devoted to politics? Mm. And I think in a variety of ways, Aristotle indicates that, no, there's some real problems with this. Good. So therefore, so if you want to think of it that way, yes, if it's second best or third best or less than ideal, it's less than ideal because it's not necessarily aiming at the most capable, the most virtuous type of rule, right? But then it turns out that that's maybe not the best or most important thing for Aristotle, right? Okay, so very quickly going through some of the issues in Book 4, Chapter 11. Again, you should try to understand why the most fundamental reasons why this middling regime is going to be less subject to factional conflict, less subject to change, just more stable. And you have to decide for yourselves, how effective you think the arguments are. The first reason he gives is that the middling elements of a regime, the middle class, is more reasonable than a democratic society, or rather a democratic class or an oligarchic class, or I guess you use the term more reasonable than the poor or the wealthy, right? And here you could easily say, well, therefore you're saying that somehow they're going to be the most rational rulers. But if you look at the actual explanation, it seems to be more that they're more likely just to avoiding the irrationalities of either the wealthy or the poor is slightly different from saying that you're going to get the most rational rulers in this class.
Right. So you might say the rich are likely to be spoiled, the
Yes.
poor are likely to just be screwed up for all sorts of other reasons, and
Yes.
then
Yes,
so
that's
it's
it.
not about achieving the best; it's
That's
about
it.
mitigating the worst.
That's it exactly. And this issue of and if you think that that's unfair to the poor, Aristotle will agree with you somewhat, because he's always emphasizing the fact that when you're talking about oligarchy or even aristocracy, there's always going to be a kind of arrogance on their part, which is that creates huge political problems. And if not arrogance, also a political ambition, right? He's saying essentially that people who have political ambition are going to be aristocrats or oligarchs of one kind or another, maybe even if they're coming from the poor class. Um, and so the argument is almost that the middling regime is better precisely because it's going to restrain the opportunities for ambition in a way.
Good. Yeah, I think ambition is the crucial part here.
Yes, and then it gets back to the whole point about political virtue, right? In some ways, what makes this regime best is that it's going to lessen the opportunities for the political virtuoso, right, to come to power. Then the middling regime is going to be able to resist that. One way he puts this in terms of the second reason is that the middle class regime likes to rule least, or least likes to rule. And this is very close to saying that the middling element in a regime, the middle class, is going to be less politicized, right? And this, it gets to the point that in some circumstances, in many circumstances, you don't want a regime that's going to maximize political participation or political engagement, right? That can be a dangerous thing, right? So on the one hand, there are certainly virtues that you demonstrate through citizenship. People are going to want to be political in some sense, but when he's talking about even the decent forms of democracy, he says what makes the decent forms of democracy better from the less good forms is that you have a class in if you have a class in democracy where people are engaged in private affairs such that they're not obsessed with political life, right? This will end up being more stable, not least because, and this is important, they're going to be more likely to rely on a stable set of a stable set of laws, right? And so you should try to think of some ways to integrate the theme of the rule of law into what makes a regime stable. And this gets a little bit complicated. I'm going to talk about it more in some other review sessions I'll post online. But his basic idea is that, your first thought might be, well, he also says that the laws of any regime are just going to be based on the regime. Well, what's so great about the rule of law? But he does think of the rule of law as a constraint on any regime. So any regime that is relying on a more or less stable set of rules is going to be less oppressive and basically less annoying is the wrong word. But even if you are, if you're an oligarch in a democratic society, if the Democrats are ruling through a stable set of rules, that's better than simply a society that's based upon decrees, right? Or a sense that, it just gets down to, he's really addressing this point about a fundamental sense of fairness. And he's saying that typically having a stable set of rules will prevent people from having a sense of the regime as a threat, perhaps, is a way. Does that make sense?
I think so. Would another way of putting it be the rule of law will assure that that laws or that government won't just be done on a whim or won't be just be done just because some guy in power just decides this is the best way to do it.
Exactly. And you can think in the most basic thing, with most elementary sense of justice, is that if one person commits a crime and another person creates the identical crime, they should receive the same process, they should receive the same penalty. And so if you break away from that and you're deciding, oh no, this person, because he's this kind of person and receives a different kind of penalty, we can see how we might want to think about how tempting that can be in a lot of circumstances, but we can also see how that could easily be a source of political discord. So in that sense, by being partially disengaged from politics, by being less than fully politicized, you have to tie that into, well, how are they going to rule then if they're not focused on political life? Well, the idea is that, they're more likely to accept a stable set of laws, stable set of rules, and it's going to be easier to preserve the regime for that reason. Okay. The third issue he raises is closely connected to this. He basically says the city wishes to be constituted by those who are equal. And what does he mean by this? It's almost the same as the first point he makes about the advantages of the middle class regime. It basically gets back to the fact that the wealthy are going to be less likely to accept rule by others. And what he almost seems to be saying here is that there'll be perhaps a tendency of the poor to be either less capable, perhaps too humble to rule. I don't know. That makes a certain amount of sense as well. I mean, if you're coming from Aristotle's perspective, that you have to have some degree of essentially some degree of property, right, to develop the capacity to rule, develop the kinds of knowledge, and this is not so far-fetched. But then for the oligarchs, essentially, it's almost too much leisure, too much insulation from any sense of economic need is going to make it more difficult for you to accept any kind of restraint, right? So it gets back to this whole point of arrogance. Fourth point connected to that, the middle class regime in general is going to have a greater sense of security. And what he means simply by this is that the middling element is not going to feel plotted against, right? So the sense of economic security is going to reinforce the stability of the regime. Fifth point, middling element is likely to ally with those who are in danger of being overwhelmed. And you can think of this, again, really one way to think of the middling regime is that they are almost approximating the Aristotelian perspective on a partial conception of the truth of oligarchy and democracy. So they're more likely to shift their political allegiance depending on changed circumstances, right, as opposed to simply having what we might call a strictly ideological view. Makes a certain amount of sense. The sixth issue is that tyranny is less likely to emerge from the middling regime. And here, to explain this, again, it helps to look at Book 5. Though there, as you also see, he qualifies the statement in Book 4 because he seems to focus on the fact that tyranny is more likely to emerge in oligarchic regimes. And in Book 5, he says that actually democracy seems to be more stable on this grounds. Tyranny is actually more of a danger in oligarchy, though it's connected to the conflict between oligarchs and democrats, because he says it's exactly... I mean, the main problem with oligarchy in Book 5 is that oligarchies are beset by challenges both from democrats, those who have a different conception of the regime, but also strife amongst the ambitious, right? And so that, it's for that reason he says in Book 5 that demagoguery, right, riling up the people against the oligarchic regime, can come from within the regime itself, right? So it gets back to this fact that oligarchies and ultimately aristocracies as well seem to produce more ambitious individuals, right? And so therefore a middling regime, which is not focusing on essentially elevating those kinds of ambitions, is going to be more stable for that reason, right? It's essentially saying the mediocrity has some political advantages. Mediocrity has some advantages. This leads right to the seventh point, which is that the middling regimes tend to be have the greatest degree of freedom from factional strife, and that would just seem to be obvious. The final point seems to be kind of pushing things overboard, where he says that the best legislators come from the middling element, from the middle class citizens, and that to me seems maybe pushing things too far, in the sense that, because that doesn't seem to be the thrust of the argument. Which is, the thrust of the argument is that you don't need to have the best political leaders if you have this particular class. And it's almost the point that you're less likely to have these sort of ambitious but supremely virtuous individuals emerging out of a middling regime. Okay, so that covers the parts from Book 4, Chapter 11. What you should also try to work into your answer, and we'll just go through this very quickly, are, why are the other regimes more unstable? Because you see from Book 4 that it's all about stability and preservation. So you should try to say a few things about, well, what are the defects of oligarchy that cause it to be unstable, or the defects of what he refers to in Book 4 as the so-called aristocracy in Chapter 8 of Book 4, and the defects of democracy as well. And there's sort of general reasons for this, and then reasons particular to each of those other regimes. And the general reason is simply that the other regimes are typically only embodying, this one-sided perspective on justice, right? And more so than any of the other regimes, the middling regime is going to combine, at least two, right? At least democracy and oligarchy in some sense, making it more stable for that reason. Every other regime, by virtue of being partial, right, is going to be more subject to challenge. Okay.
So in some sense, you can see a certain Aristotelian logic working here, or two aspects of Aristotelian logic. One is the idea that we can find partial truths in the things we observe.
Yes.
Right? And again, we can think about Aristotle as a scientist who's looking at things
Yep.
and trying to see the truths in them.
Yes.
And then sort of Aristotle's general predilection towards the mean, towards the average. Right?
Yes. Yeah.
So saying, okay, we look at it and there's something good about what there's a certain logic to what the oligarchs,
yes,
what's going on there. And there's a certain logic to the democratic claim. We can observe them. Neither of them are perfect by any means, but there's something partially true about them.
Yes.
And so let's split the difference.
Yes, that's it exactly. The only caveat I would add, and maybe this isn't so important for the exam, is that the doctrine of the mean in ethics is a slightly different thing.
Of course,
but politically, that's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of the dynamic of the book, as I stated in lecture, it's talking his aristocratic students down, right? That you cannot aim for a single superlative conception of political virtue, precisely because these other conceptions have a partial truth as well. I think what you'll find, perhaps, is that in terms of his emphasis on the regimes that are really going to be most unstable, it seems that oligarchy and aristocracy seems to be the ones that are really going to be subject to challenge, and there seems to be a greater potential for democracy in terms of this issue of stability. Mm-hmm. So that's something to consider. But he basically considers the middling regime as a type of version of democracy, the best form, or at least it's closer. It's the version of polity that's closest to democracy. Okay. Let's see if we have anything else to add.
Well, and this is something we were talking about before, but it might just be worth going over, because some students in my tutorial, and I think generally that get confused, is so Aristotle gives us 6 regimes.
Yes. Yeah.
And then he sort of switches the terms of conversation. Then he's less talking about the 6 regimes, right?
Yes.
So the 6 regimes, he says, there's the rule. You do basically based on the number of people ruling, and then whether it's good or perverted.
Yes.
And then he starts switching. He's talking about class all of a sudden.
Yes, I think there's a pretty straightforward reason for this, which is just that in actual practice, the few who rule are going to be the wealthy, and the many are going to be the poor. And the middling regime is a way of trying to split that difference. He's saying that you could think of a regime in which it's neither the wealthy or the few, or the wealthy or the many ruling. But keep in mind, he also says that this is kind of him projecting, right? He says this is not really a regime that exists. It's something something that he's imagining. What I think is also interesting is how much, particularly in Book 4, the notion of kingship or aristocracy as a genuine alternative kind of just disappears. And that's something you should notice in terms of, well, why does he think the middling regime is better than just an aristocracy? Maybe there could be an aristocracy where it's the wise and the good, aiming for the rule of the whole. And the answer is in his discussion of so-called aristocracy, when his basic point is that it's very difficult to create, or particularly to maintain, a regime based on, what we might call a meritocracy, right? Which is really what he means by aristocracy. And that's why he keeps talking about how aristocracy associates eventually with terms like, the rule of the well-born or inherited wealth. It's almost as if he's saying there's a tendency, even if your regime is aristocratic/meritocratic in some sense, it's going to have this tendency to become a regime based upon inheritance in one way or another. And so therefore, the real problem with what he calls so-called aristocracies is that they're always leaning in this oligarchic direction, right? And that's what makes it less desirable than the middling elements, right? And it won't. It's the so-called aristocracy is a difficult sell for modern people in general, because he's basically saying that, well, we're just going to have this elite based upon inherited privilege, and he's saying, well, there are worse alternatives, assuming that elite really does see itself as having a connection to the common good, and assuming that those that they're ruling over in some sense also see that their power is justified. That's not impossible to imagine, and we'd say it seems unlikely, but Aristotle is also quick to note that any regime of that kind, the polity called so-called aristocracy, has this tendency to move in the oligarchic direction. Okay, let's move on to the second question. Aristotle's political theory, this is a hypothetical quote here, quote, Aristotle's political theory reflects the general prejudices of Greek aristocrats. This can be seen in his defense of slavery and patriarchy, his disdain for commerce, such acquisition or business expertise that he refers to in Book 2, and in his defense of an aristocracy, particularly in Book 7 of the Politics, as the simply best regime. So is this statement correct or incorrect? Does it contain some partial truths? I think what we can see here is, or you should focus on, are the ways in which he sets up, particularly in the case of slavery, a theoretical standard which seems to be at odds with actual Greek practice. So you can't simply say that he's defending slavery, because the standard of natural slavery would seem to bring almost all existing slavery, in fact, all existing slavery, into question. So what you need to do there is just articulate briefly what that standard is. And it basically comes down to the standard for natural slavery seems to be the standard for natural rule within an organism, within the human body. It's the natural rule of mind over body. And it becomes a problem because that relationship doesn't seem possible in terms of the relationships between human beings. In terms of patriarchy, here is where, if you're going to make the case that he's simply reflecting, the Greek standards, this is where you're going to be able to make the strongest case, because there's really almost no hint of any kind of challenge to the injustice of Greek patriarchy. But the hints are there. In terms of describing the marital relation as political rule, ruling and being ruled in turn, right away you can see that, well, that's not actually reflected in practice. And he seems to be saying, well, this is because of the superior rationality of men, essentially. And the main evidence that this is defective is the fact that he illustrates this with the reference to, say, the play Ajax towards the end of Book 2. So, which was the play where Ajax basically goes insane from rage, and his wife is trying to talk him down. And so this is, Aristotle is aware then of, or he's hinting at, the problem of patriarchy. Though you'd be quite correct to say that he's not directly challenging this in almost any way. And so here you might want to think about this in terms of the broader project of politics, which really gets back to some of the issues from the first question, which is that preservation ends up being pretty much the most important political goal. So any project of political reform has to take into account, first, what is possible as opposed to what is ideal. And therefore, you have to moderate any kind of political project based upon whether it's going to be accepted or whether it's going to potentially bring in worse or more disruptive changes. And I think in the case of patriarchy, Aristotle would have said, whatever it's justice or injustice, this is something that's just so completely ingrained in the society, it doesn't seem as if there's much possibility for changing it. Right? So he's basically, what's the term people use? Dog whistling or something like that, the silent whistle, right? It's a silent whistle for those who want to see this, right? And he thinks it's also there in other aspects of Greek culture. That is the critique of patriarchy, which you can certainly see in Greek tragedy in a lot of ways, or Greek comedy, or in Plato's Republic. The one unironic argument of Socrates is that, patriarchy really is unjust, right? In a way, right? There's no reason to assume that women have less capacity to be philosophers than men, for instance. The issue of commerce and acquisition, it's, how would I put it? Pretty clear that he's not simply saying commerce is bad, because he also points out in Book 2 that we have to do all these things. You have to develop economic expertise. Political leaders should acquire all this knowledge. But at the same time, he's conceding something, maybe quite a bit, to the aristocratic disdain for commerce. Though, the typical aristocrat disdains commerce because they see themselves as warriors, right? They see them, or at least citizens, right? And Aristotle accepts that to some degree because he thinks that there is this tendency to be overcome by the requirements of mere life and mere existence. And so even though that's necessary, you can't simply rely on nature to provide for you. And he has that very ironic discussion of nature providing for all organisms in the same way that the mother provides for the child or the animal provides for their young, which is pretty clearly a joke. It's sometimes hard to get Aristotle's jokes, but it's a joke. Nature in itself can't be understood as benevolent in that way. But he doesn't entirely want to do away with the aristocratic concern or partial disdain for commerce, even though it's necessary. Does that make
I think
sense?
so. So I mean, would a good way of putting it maybe be, okay, so we have a household. We need to maintain the household.
Yes.
And we need to supply all the needs of the household. And so that will have to involve going out and engaging in commerce. We're going to have to trade with people. We're going to have to do these things.
Yes.
But the problem is that can sometimes breed a disposition in people to acquire simply for the sake of acquiring.
Exactly.
And then you're no longer actually doing what you're supposed to be doing with commerce, which is providing the means of subsistence for the household.
Yeah, exactly. So he wants to. So that's an aspect of Greek society that he finds somewhat healthy, right? The fact that there is already a predisposition to sort of question commerce in that way. Okay, now we come to the real difficult part of this question, which is when Aristotle seems to be defending an aristocracy in Book 7. Isn't he simply reflecting prejudices of Greek aristocrats, right, who would hold up the life of the soldier, the warrior, as being what's greatest? And the way to think about this is, again, it comes back to some of the issues raised in the first question. Everything he said about the character of political life would seem to bring this regime into question, insofar as you have a regime where a single regime conception, the conception of the not only aristocrats but military aristocrats, are going to be excluding every other political claim. And so at the very simplest level, this is a regime, you can think of it in terms of his discussion of Sparta in Book 2, where he says, well, yeah, this is sort of an aristocratic regime, but they're spending all their time and energy just maintaining their military power, right? So this almost comes back to the question of commerce, right? If military power is a necessity, and that's part of the point of the discussion of Book 7, which is that this is another partial perspective you have to take into account. But just as commerce can become the means that turns into an end, military power can work the same way, right? You create a regime where you're going to be setting up the warrior aristocrats as those who are in charge, but then all their energy, all the culture has to be focused simply on maintaining that military power. And so it's not clear how that regime in Book 7 would be that different from the Spartan regime in that sense. I can't really think they would be subject to the same problems, right? And the way he sort of highlights this is that, they're going to be ruling over a class of farmer slaves, right? And those, he says, are the people who actually make the best citizens, right? In books 4 through 6. In other words, it seems unlikely that those individuals are simply going to accept being completely subordinated. So then your regime is just going to be hammering the farmer slaves down, just like the Spartans are constantly hammering down the helots. So you have to take that into account in terms of understanding in what sense this regime cannot be understood as the best. It seems to be, it's almost as if Aristotle is criticizing a certain mode of theorizing. As if he's theorizing, we talked earlier about this question of, well, is the middling regime best in the sense of ideal? It's almost as if in Book 7 he's saying, our Greek society would tend to conceive of the ideal this way, right? But here, but we can, looking at it, having read all through the politics now, we can see all the problems that would emerge in that kind of regime. A lot of it in terms of the instability of it, but possibly as well the fact that it's going to be, and here I guess I'm speculating a little bit, it doesn't seem, it's not apparent to me, and Aristotle doesn't give any indication how philosophy fits into this regime, where that seems much more clear in the case of the middling regime, right? Not least because he's also really emphasizing the religious aspects of this regime, which, as Socrates certainly knew, can get philosophers into a great deal of trouble if the regime is trying to impose a really strict conception of religious belief. Okay.
So I mean, you can think about these things in terms of what gets confusing with Aristotle is they'll say best, and then it's not. He sort of switches what he means by best sometimes. In a way, what I understand you to be saying is you can imagine something as being best in a certain sense.
Yes.
But then once you take the realities of what politics demands of us, it starts to look not so good.
Yeah.
So if you can imagine, the rule of all these great people and they're just ruling according to a certain view of virtue.
Yeah.
But the reality of political rule implies a certain sense of first tamping down on dissent, and the breeding of now my words are escaping me, but the ambition in the ruling class, and that this will then descend into oligarchy, and so we have to be careful of these things.
No, absolutely, and also that there ends up just being very different conceptions of what is best, and it's a difficult balancing act for Aristotle, because on the one hand he wants to say that there is something good about the political, there's something good about the longing for the noble that all political life involves, but he thinks that this best regime takes it in a dangerous direction, because at a certain point, the kind of sacrifice that's involved in engaging in politics turns into a kind of valorization of the ultimate sacrifice, and the notion that military virtue is the only source of virtue, and somehow the purpose of the society is simply to enable that virtue. And I think Aristotle wants to say that this is necessary, you can't get away from the need for that, but neither do you want your society to become focused on that. Just in the same way you don't want, your society needs economics, your society needs commerce, but you don't want that to become its overwhelming purpose. Now this leads him very close to saying, this leads into the questions of Book 8, well then what then is the purpose? And we can leave that. Yeah. We can leave that aside.
Let's not confuse everybody.
We can leave that aside for now. Okay. Moving right along, we're running a little bit out of time because, as I told Abe, I have to take my kids to tennis lessons soon. The Plato questions. Quote, humankind cannot bear very much reality, T.S. Eliot. Socrates suggests at various points in the Republic that mythology can be used as a political tool. I think I would also add mythology could also include just lying as a deception as a political tool. Myths are a polite way of referring to lies. What are the main noble or medicinal lies in the Republic, and in what sense are they needed in order to blur or obscure harsh truths? And what political purposes are served by the noble or medicinal lies? And how does medicinal lying play a role in other themes in the Republic? And the way to think about this is that the Republic, it seems to me, raises a puzzle about noble lying, and which is that we all recognize, most of us would recognize, well, in some circumstances, white lies are going to be acceptable. And then the thought experiment of the Republic is that, okay, well, if it's acceptable in small things, is deception acceptable when it's aiming for great things, for larger things? So it starts off in the discussion of Cephalus in Book 1, is it just to give the weapon back to your enraged friends? And then it goes further and further and further. And to what extent then should truth, an unvarnished conception of the truth, be subordinated to the requirements of political justice or political harmony? And we see this theme emerge in all kinds of different ways. And the real problem with this question will probably be that there's a lot to talk about. There's not one single answer to this question. And so, starting with the noble lie itself, you might want to think of it in terms of, what makes the lie noble, right? And the noble lie itself is that, everyone is coming from, has a kind of common ancestry. Everyone in the city is going to have this basic unity. And so what he's saying here is that there's something noble about a society if they're seeing themselves as integrated, whether as a family or almost like an organism, right? And, perhaps Socrates is saying that is something that's necessary for political life, right? You could connect it to even the image of the cave, right? Is Socrates saying that the notion of political unity is necessary, so it's noble to do to tell the tales that are necessary to create that sense of civic identity, that this is necessary, that there's no simple philosophical or purely rational way to justify this? He's coming very close to saying that, it seems, that the basis, and again, think of what he says about the noble lie. He's not saying that he just invented this now, right? He's saying that this is something that happens everywhere, more or less. So that is the main focus of the noble lie itself. But then you'll want to take into account the various ways in which deception is being used to structure the city and speech as a whole. Or if not exactly deception, only allowing the guardians in particular to have a partial conception of the truth, a partial view on the world. Ultimately, creating the Guardians in Book 4 is based upon really deceiving them into thinking that their self-interest is utterly identical with the city. So what you should talk about then are the various ways in which Socrates is experimenting with, trying to illuminate this question of how far can you take, once you start from that notion that, well, deception can be acceptable in some circumstances, is it still justified as you go further and further and further? Plato hints at the problem with this when in Book 2, when Socrates is talking about the new conception of theology that would be necessary to perfectly unify the city. And the thing we should note is that truth doesn't seem to be the standard that's going to govern this conception of theology. He says that, the old myths of Homer, even if they've got their secret truths and then somehow, they cause too much problems, we should have this new conception of the divinity. But then he also says that, what people hate most, in a way, are being lied to in their soul about these things, right? And that's his sort of his way of hinting that deception ends up being a political tool, but it's also the most dangerous tool in a way, precisely because what happens if the civic mythology that you create is seen through at some level, and so this, I think, is part of the anti-utopian message of the politic, or not the politics, though that has an anti-utopian message too, but of the Republic, which is that perfect political unity and that's perfect political justice would require just obscuring the tensions in political life, right? And that's the entire point of the education of the Guardians. Okay, so those are some of the ways in which the themes of deception emerges. I mean, another way of thinking of the dangers of deception, Socrates illustrates, the lust for political power through the ring of Gyges, right? And so the ring that makes you invisible, right? So deception is the most dangerous tool of any kind. This is the main tool, for those who would want to pursue power. The other theme of deception comes out in regards to Socrates' presentation of philosophy in the Republic. And I'll just speak very briefly about this because we're running out of time and I want to get to the other question as well. But the basic idea here is that, one theme of the Republic is, to what extent can philosophy be made compatible with political life? And it seems to me that Socrates presents a kind of noble lie about philosophy that is meant to potentially mislead Glaucon and Adeimantus about the kind of knowledge possessed by philosophers. And the basic way to think about this is that there's a tension between Socrates' most thematic discussions of the ideas as these permanent, unchanging entities, that this is what philosophical knowledge is. Philosophers are able to pierce the veil of reality and understand these stable underlying moral truths. What Socrates actually does in the Republic, though, it seems to be more of an open-ended investigation of political life that reveals more problems than anything else, right? One way to think about this is that the idea of ideas is implicit in language, right? So the idea of justice and referring to people as just, cities as just, it implies that there's this thing, that justice, that unifies them both. And at the very least, what we should see in the Republic is that there seems to be, there's a tension there, there's a problem there. If, for instance, we think of justice as a kind of harmony, the justice that might be a perfect justice in political life might not be conducive to perfect justice within the human soul. So where Glaucon and Adeimantus seem to be led in the direction that these ideas are directly informing what the philosopher knows, or they constitute philosophical knowledge, Socrates seems to be using them as hypotheses, right, to investigate political life. And then finally, you might want to consider the fact that Socrates seems to reintroduce the theme of religion in the end of Book 10 as a kind of, a kind of a way of providing compensation for the limits of justice in political life, which seems to be disappointing if you think that Socrates is going to end up explaining why even a just person who has the greatest reputation for injustice would still be preferable to choose that. Well, you have this somewhat deflating answer at the end, which is that, well, this only really makes sense in light of a cosmic conception of justice. And at that point, I guess, in the story, Glaucon and Mantis are sort of being accepting, though even they're kind of at least a little uncertain.
They're probably tired.
They're probably tired at that point. They're ready to go home. Okay, so much for that question. We've got just about enough time to look at the final question. And the final question begins with a quote from C.S. Lewis, quote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive." Do you think Plato's Republic illustrates the meaning of this quote, and if so, in what way? And I think the first thing to note is that there's going to be a considerable degree of overlap between these two questions. What you essentially have to do here is think about the city and speech that's created in the Republic, and think about on what grounds you would label it tyrannical. Because the heart of the question is whether or not the attempt to achieve justice ends up being tyrannical itself. So you'd want to focus on particularly the education of the guardians. In what sense is what's necessary to educate the guardians through this complete control of culture, in what sense is that tyrannical? In what sense is the separation of individuals into classes tyrannical? Your answer might be that it's not tyrannical. Your answer might be that it's merely impossible, or perhaps very difficult. You might want to go even further, and probably should, into Book 5, and where you're faced with the question of, if at some level, the very existence of, say, families is a source of injustice, as a source of tension within the political society, a source of differentiation that makes justice more difficult, does this mean that the elimination of that tension is justified in the name of justice? Or does that turn into a kind of tyranny as well? And in what sense? So I think this question really gets at the heart of the political dimension of the Republic. All right. Nothing to add to that?
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Abe, for stopping by and helping me out with this. And if anyone listening to this, if there's still plenty of time until the exam, if you have questions, feel free to drop me a line. Okay, good luck with the rest of your study period, and I'll see you on December 18th.